what I try to show in my work is that the true opposite of racist isn't not racist, it's anti-racist. And so if we understand a racist idea as any notion that suggests, let's say, a racial group is superior or inferior to another racial group, what's the opposite of racial hierarchy? It's a notion of racial equality, that the racial groups are equals. If a racist policy is any measure that is leading to or maintaining racial inequity or injustice between racial groups, what's the opposite of that? A policy that's leading to equity, and justice. And if a person who is racist is constantly saying, I'm not racist, every single time they express a racist idea or support a racist policy, what's the opposite of that? The opposite of that is an anti-racist saying, you know what I actually just did was racist. But now I'm going to change. Now I'm going to grow. Now I'm going to repair the damage that I'm wrought.
And you're underpinning what you've just outlined is the idea that we all have the capacity to say racist things and to hold racist views, but that we have the capacity to change. So just explain that a little bit more.
Well, underlying that is also, I think we have to reframe both the term racist and the term anti-racist as not identities. So these aren't terms of who a person is. These are terms describing what a person is being in any given moment based on what they're saying or doing or not doing. And the reason why sort of this became critical for me is because, particularly studying the history of racist and anti-racist ideas, I came across so many people across history, from Western Europe to the United States, who were expressing racist and anti-racist ideas in the same speech, in the same paragraph of the same speech. To give an example, I live in Boston, where, of course, there were a lot of historic abolitionists. So abolitionists, on the one hand, would say slavery is evil and it needs to end immediately, and there's no argument that justifies why Black people should be enslaved another minute. And when they were making that claim, they were expressing anti-racist ideas. But then they would also say that slavery is so dehumanizing that it has literally made Black people into brutes, that they have no connection to humanity. And that idea that enslaved people were brutes, were subhuman, were racist ideas. And those racist ideas then were the reason why you had some abolitionists during the Civil War and afterwards were against civil and voting rights for newly freed people, because they need to be civilized first. And so when I realized you had people expressing both ideas, how can you call them essentially racist or anti-racist? How could you say that's who they are? But what you can say is when a person is expressing opposition to slavery, they're being anti-racist. When they're claiming that enslaved people are subhuman brutes, they're being racist. And the reason why this is also critical to your question is because what it means is that people have the capacity to change, right? So the abolitionist can start to realize that when they're making the case that slavery isn't dehumanizing, that is not just dehumanizing, but it has literally made Black people into brutes, that they're expressing an idea that's actually reinforcing the very institution that they're opposing. And then maybe some abolitionists will change that and stop saying that racist idea. But it's also critical as it relates to children, because it allows us to recognize that the way in which people internalize racist ideas is through the environment that they're raised in. And so we're just not going to assume that somebody is too young if they're being born and raised in the same environment, hearing the same messages that we are. And indeed, at least in the United States, scholars have found that by 3 years old, our kids have an adult-like conception of race. They're already, by 3 years old, attaching skin color to behavioral qualities like smartness, like cleanliness, and like honesty.
And just explain a little bit more about that research, because those sections in the book that are underpinned by research having been done some time ago, but also contemporary research, suggests actually quite shocking revelations for all of us, whether we're parents or not. And clearly it's also creating controversy in the United States, because there is an argument made almost entirely by people who are determined to exist in that camp where they say, I don't see the color of people's skin, which is another category altogether, that this is crazy to say that a child recognizes difference in that way. So just explain a little bit more about that research.
I mean, unfortunately, there was a time when scientists proved to us that the earth was round. And many people thought that they were crazy because we're walking on a flat surface. How could the earth be round? I mention that because it doesn't really matter to me how it sounds to people. What matters to me is the science itself. And, you not only have that study that I just sort of described, you have studies that show that babies start to see and understand skin color between 3 and 9 months. You also have studies that find that babies, if they're being raised in a homogeneous environment, are more likely to have a preference for a particular skin color, while babies who are being raised around a more heterogeneous environment are more likely to not do that. You have baby studies that are finding that. You have studies that are finding that by 5 years old, the majority of white young people have what's called white bias, in which they're preferencing, particular people with white skin. And so I think for many people, the question is, how could this happen? These kids are so young. How could they already be thinking this way? And people have this perspective that these ideas, that these racist ideas are so sophisticated. How could a young child understand something like dark is bad? That's just too sophisticated, apparently. How could an extremely young child understand light is pretty? That must be too sophisticated for a 2-year-old to understand. But if they're constantly, but it's actually not, right? The reason why these ideas have spread across time, have spread across the world, and are still with us is because they're so simple. And one of the ways in which it happens with very young children, I mentioned environment. Think about let's take a white child, and that white child is brought home to a homogeneous, predominantly white neighborhood, and let's say almost all the books that are read to that child have white faces, and let's say if pretty much all the media that white child is seeing on TV are white. And let's say all the people, almost, that the parents are bringing to the home, meaning these are the people we value, have white faces. And then let's say as that child starts walking and the parent is walking by a black person, that child sees their parent get scared. And then let's say, that child goes to the library or goes to school, and everyone who is being taught to him as great are white. All of these messages about white superiority are being taught directly and indirectly to this child. And no one else is counteracting those ideas. And so these are very simple ideas. If you put a child or a person in an environment in which you're constantly saying this particular skin color is primary and good, what else is that child going to think by the time they're 5 or 7 years old?